Professor Harrington had always believed himself to be untouchable. For years, he had roamed the halls of Wellington University with an air of superiority, respected by some, feared by others. His reputation as a brilliant academic was unquestioned, but his unspoken bias against black students had become an open secret. He never used racial slurs, never made explicitly bigoted remarks, but his actions spoke louder than words. Black students who excelled in his class were accused of cheating, those who challenged him were dismissed as disrespectful, and those who simply tried to exist were ignored. So when Daniel Richardson, a quiet but intelligent young black man, entered his political science class that semester, Harrington barely acknowledged his presence. It wasn't until the third week of the semester that Daniel even caught his attention. The lecture had been about political systems in developing nations, and a discussion broke out regarding the role of colonialism in shaping modern governance. Most students were content to listen, nodding along as Harrington gave his opinion. But then Daniel raised his hand. Harrington sighed, already annoyed. "Yes. I think you're overlooking an important point," Daniel said calmly. "Colonialism didn't just leave behind governance structures, it also left behind economic exploitation that still exists today. The political instability you mentioned is often rooted in that." A hush fell over the room. Few students ever contradicted Harrington so directly. The professor adjusted his glasses and forced a chuckle. "That's an awfully simplistic take, Mr. Richardson. You're implying that these nations have no agency, no ability to govern themselves properly." "That's not what I'm saying," Daniel countered, maintaining his composure. "I'm saying that you can't ignore the long-term impact of external influence. Political instability doesn't exist in a vacuum." Harrington's expression hardened. He wasn't used to being questioned, least of all by a black student. "And you've written peer-reviewed research on this, I presume?" A few students chuckled nervously. Daniel didn't smile. He knew exactly what Harrington was doing. "I don't need to be a published scholar to recognize basic historical patterns," Daniel said. The professor's lips thinned. He turned away without another word, returning to his lecture as if Daniel didn't exist. From that day on, Harrington made sure Daniel felt his disapproval. The next few weeks were a slow but deliberate campaign of subtle harassment. Whenever Daniel submitted a paper, he'd receive vague criticism. "Weak argument, lacks originality, you should read more on this topic." No specific feedback, just enough to knock down his grades. Meanwhile, his white classmates who had written similar arguments received praise. The other students noticed. Jake, one of Daniel's close friends and a white student in the class, was the first to say something. "Dude, I don't know how you're keeping your cool," Jake muttered one afternoon. They were sitting in the library reviewing their latest essays. "I got an A for saying almost the exact same thing you did, and he gave you a C+. He's screwing you over." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I know. So say something. Go to the department head." Daniel shook his head. "And say what? That my professor doesn't like me? That's not enough." Jake frowned. "But this isn't fair." "It never is." Daniel had dealt with people like Harrington before. He had learned that the worst kind of racism wasn't the loud, obvious kind, it was the quiet, polite kind that made sure you never got ahead while pretending it was your own fault. But Harrington wasn't done. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Daniel was in class, taking notes as usual, when another student, Liam, a white guy sitting next to him, struggled to grasp a concept about electoral systems. Daniel had spent hours studying the topic, so he leaned over and whispered a quick explanation. Liam's face lit up. "Oh, that actually makes sense. Thanks, man." Before Daniel could reply, Harrington's voice sliced through the room. "Mr. Richardson," he said, his tone sharp. "Do you have something to add to the lecture?" The room went silent. Daniel looked up, confused. "No, sir. I was just explaining." "Explaining?" Harrington cut him off. "And here I thought I was the professor." A few students shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't trying to interrupt," Daniel said carefully. Harrington crossed his arms. "If you believe you're more qualified to teach this class than I am, perhaps you'd like to take over the lecture?" Daniel clenched his jaw. He could feel every eye on him, waiting to see how he'd respond. "No, sir." Harrington smirked. "Then I'd suggest you stop acting like a know-it-all and start listening." A few students chuckled. Daniel simply nodded and went back to taking notes, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just about today. Harrington had wanted an excuse to humiliate him in front of the class. And now he had one. But the worst was yet to come. That evening, Daniel checked his student portal and saw that his last assignment had been marked. Final grade, F. His stomach dropped. He opened the feedback section, expecting to see some kind of reasoning. Instead, there was only one sentence. fails to meet the academic standards of this course. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. An F? He had done everything right. He had cited sources, structured his arguments well, and followed the guidelines to the letter. There was no way this was justified. For the first time, Daniel realized this was more than just bias. Harrington was trying to get rid of him. And if Daniel didn't do something soon, he just might succeed. Daniel stared at the failing grade on his screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just an unfair mark, this was a deliberate attack. He had worked hard on that paper, followed every requirement, and yet Harrington had dismissed it with a single sentence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He wanted to write an email demanding an explanation, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Harrington wouldn't engage in a discussion. He had already made up his mind. A deep frustration settled in Daniel's chest. This was what people meant when they talked about institutional racism, not outright slurs, not blatant violence, but unjust obstacles disguised as academic judgment. He took a deep breath. I have to be smart about this. The next morning, Daniel decided to confront Harrington in person. He waited until after class, approaching the professor's desk as students filed out of the lecture hall. Professor Harrington, do you have a moment? Harrington barely looked up as he stacked his papers. Make it quick. I wanted to discuss my last paper. I don't understand the grade I received. Harrington finally met his eyes, a thin smile forming. There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Richardson. Your work was inadequate. Daniel kept his tone calm. I followed all the guidelines. If there was an issue, I'd appreciate specific feedback. The professor sighed dramatically. You see, that's the problem with students like you. Daniel's jaw tightened. Students like me? Harrington leaned back, folding his arms. Students who think they're entitled to good grades just because they put in effort. Academic excellence isn't about effort, it's about quality. And frankly, your work wasn't up to standard. Daniel inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed. Then explain what was wrong with it. Harrington smirked. If you don't understand, maybe you should rethink whether this course is right for you. Daniel stared at him, heart pounding. He wasn't going to get a real answer. Harrington wanted him frustrated. He wanted him to lash out so he could label him as aggressive or disrespectful. Daniel turned on his heel and walked out. Not today. But he wasn't giving up. That evening, Daniel met with Professor Ellis, another faculty member known for being fair. He asked if she could review his paper and give him an honest opinion. After reading it, Ellis looked up, frowning. There's nothing wrong with this paper, Daniel. In fact, it's excellent. Daniel exhaled. He wasn't crazy. He knew his work was solid. I don't want to assume anything, Ellis continued carefully. But if I were you, I'd file a formal complaint. Daniel hesitated. Complaints against professors were rarely taken seriously, especially against someone as powerful as Harrington. But what other choice did he have? The next morning, he submitted an official grievance to the university's academic board. The response came within 24 hours. Complaint dismissed. No explanation. No hearing. Just a single email stating that there was insufficient evidence to question Harrington's grading. Daniel read the email twice, then 3 times, his hands trembling. They didn't even pretend to investigate. They just sided with him automatically. Jake was furious when Daniel told him, Dude, this is insane. He's literally getting away with screwing you over. Daniel gave a humorless laugh. That's how it works, man. He knows the system is built to protect him. Jake shook his head. We should go public with this. Get other students to back you up. Daniel thought about it. He could gather testimonies, prove a pattern of discrimination, but would it matter? Would anyone listen? As he mulled it over, another problem hit. 2 days later, Daniel showed up for an important lab session, only to find his name missing from the attendance sheet. The student assistant at the door frowned. Sorry, man. Professor Harrington said you weren't on the list for today. Daniel's stomach dropped. That's impossible. I registered weeks ago. I don't know what to tell you. He said there's no more space. Daniel clenched his fists. He could see the seats inside, half of them were empty. Other students were slipping inside without issue. Only he was being turned away. He turned and saw Harrington standing at the front of the room, watching him with a small, satisfied smirk. Daniel could feel his blood boiling. He could push past the assistant, force his way inside, but then Harrington would call security. He'd be labeled as disruptive or hostile. And that would be exactly what the professor wanted. Instead, Daniel turned around and walked away. This wasn't just about a grade anymore. Harrington was trying to force him out of the program entirely. That night, Daniel sat alone in his dorm room staring at his phone. He had spent years working toward this degree, and now one man was trying to destroy everything he had built. He could let it go. Transfer to another university, avoid the fight. It would be easier. But something inside him refused to back down. He picked up his phone and dialed. His father answered on the second ring. "Hey, son. Everything okay?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Dad, I need your advice." Governor Jonathan Richardson was not a man who acted on impulse. His entire career in politics had been built on patience, strategy, and knowing when to strike. But as he listened to his son's measured yet frustrated tone over the phone, something inside him stirred, a quiet, controlled rage. "I see," he said when Daniel finished explaining. "And you're sure this wasn't just one isolated incident?" Daniel gave a dry chuckle. "If it were, I wouldn't be calling you." The governor sat back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You did everything right, filed a complaint, sought advice from another professor, and even avoided direct confrontation." He exhaled. "That man thinks he's untouchable." Daniel hesitated. "I don't want you to step in just because I'm your son. That's not why I called." Governor Richardson smiled slightly. "I know, son. You called for guidance. And I'm going to give it to you." A pause. "Keep playing the game for now. Let him think he's winning." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean? You're in a system that was never designed for people like you to succeed. You can't fight it head-on, not yet. Let him dig his own grave." And when the time is right, he let the sentence hang. Daniel nodded slowly. "All right." The governor's voice hardened. "And Daniel?" "Yeah? Don't let that man break you." For the next few days, Daniel followed his father's advice. He showed up to class, took notes, and acted as if nothing had changed. Harrington, expecting anger or defiance, was surprised to see Daniel unbothered. But Daniel was far from unbothered. He was watching. He was waiting. And then Harrington made a mistake. A week later, a guest speaker, a well-respected political analyst, was scheduled to give a lecture in Harrington's class. It was a big event, and many students, faculty members, and even administrators were in attendance. Daniel arrived early and sat near the front, quiet and observant. The lecture began smoothly. The speaker, Dr. Montgomery, discussed global political trends, and the class engaged in a lively discussion. But then, toward the end of the session, something happened. Harrington made another racist comment. It was subtle, disguised as an intellectual critique, but unmistakable. He offhandedly suggested that African nations struggle politically because their cultural mindset doesn't prioritize structured governance. A few students shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded, oblivious. Daniel's blood boiled. He could ignore a bad grade. He could ignore being excluded from a class. But he wouldn't ignore this. His hand shot up. "Yes, Mr. Richardson?" Harrington said, his tone smug as if daring him to challenge him. Daniel's voice was steady. "I just find it interesting that you attribute governance failures to culture instead of, say, centuries of economic exploitation and deliberate destabilization by external forces." A few students murmured in agreement. Dr. Montgomery, intrigued, nodded. "That's a valid counterpoint. Would you care to elaborate?" Harrington's jaw tightened. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I just think it's easy to place blame on the victims of historical injustice rather than acknowledge the role of foreign interference," Daniel continued. "And it's even easier when those victims don't look like you." The murmurs grew louder. Harrington's face darkened. "Are you implying I'm biased, Mr. Richardson?" Daniel's eyes locked onto his. "I'm not implying anything, Professor. I'm stating a fact." A heavy silence filled the room. Dr. Montgomery cleared his throat. "Well, that's certainly an important discussion to have. Perhaps Wellington University should host a broader panel on the topic." Some students clapped. Others stared at Daniel, some impressed, some stunned. Harrington, humiliated in front of colleagues and students, said nothing. Daniel could see it in his face. He had lost control of the narrative. And that was just the beginning. The next day, Daniel received an unexpected email from the dean's office. Subject: Urgent meeting request. Daniel's stomach twisted as he read it. He had a bad feeling. When he arrived at the office, the dean, an older man with silver hair, greeted him with a polite yet stiff expression. Beside him sat Professor Harrington. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Mr. Richardson," the dean began. Professor Harrington has raised concerns about your conduct in his class. Daniel's fingers curled into fists. My conduct? Yes, Harrington said smoothly, regaining his arrogance. It seems you've been creating a hostile learning environment by being combative. Daniel almost laughed. Are you seriously trying to punish me for answering a question? The dean sighed. This university values respectful discourse. While academic disagreements are encouraged, it's important that students do not challenge faculty in a way that disrupts the class. Disrupts the class. That was the excuse. That was how they would justify punishing him. And suddenly, Daniel knew exactly what his father had meant. Harrington was setting a trap, pushing him toward an official warning or even suspension. If Daniel lost his temper now, if he gave them even the smallest excuse, they'd have everything they needed to justify getting rid of him. Not today. He took a slow breath. I understand. Harrington looked disappointed. The dean seemed relieved. Good. I suggest we put this matter behind us. Daniel forced a small smile. Of course. But as he left the office, his heart pounded with a different kind of rage. Harrington thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. That night, Governor Richardson walked into Wellington University unannounced. The dean's secretary barely had time to react before he strode into the office. Governor Richardson, sir. We weren't expecting you. No, you weren't, the governor said, his voice cool but firm. That's the point. The dean, caught off guard, stood. How can I help you, Governor? The governor slowly placed a file on the desk. You can start by explaining why this university allows tenured professors to systematically discriminate against students. The dean's face paled. I'm not sure what you mean. The governor leaned in slightly, his voice dangerously calm. I mean, he said, why my son has been targeted, undermined, and falsely accused by a man who should never have been given authority over students in the first place. The dean swallowed hard. Harrington was about to learn what real power looked like. The tension in the dean's office was thick enough to choke on. Governor Richardson sat across from the dean, his presence commanding, his expression unreadable. The file he had just placed on the desk sat like a loaded weapon between them. The dean cleared his throat, clearly rattled. Governor, I assure you, we take all student concerns seriously. Richardson didn't blink. Then explain why my son's formal complaint against Professor Harrington was dismissed without investigation. The dean hesitated. He knew exactly why. The university had been protecting one of their own, assuming Daniel was just another black student who would eventually give up and move on. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't personally involved in that decision, Governor. These matters are handled by the Academic Review Board. Richardson tilted his head slightly. And yet, here I am. So, let's cut the nonsense. I want an explanation. The dean shifted uncomfortably, shooting a glance at Harrington, who sat beside him, his confidence beginning to crack. Governor Richardson, Harrington interjected, forcing a tight smile. With all due respect, I wasn't aware Daniel was your son. Had I known if... The governor's eyes snapped to him, and Harrington's words died in his throat. That's the problem, isn't it? Richardson's voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath it. You assumed he was just some nobody. A black student you could bully without consequence. Harrington swallowed. That's not true. The governor slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. Let's talk facts. He flipped open the file. Inside were records of multiple complaints filed against Harrington over the years. Complaints from other black and minority students who had experienced the same treatment. Unfair grades, exclusion from academic opportunities, vague accusations meant to sabotage their records. Every single one had been quietly dismissed. The dean's face drained of color. We can have a public conversation about this, if you'd like, Richardson continued. Perhaps a press conference? Maybe even a formal legal inquiry. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I imagine donors wouldn't appreciate funding a university that tolerates this kind of behavior. The dean's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the file. He flipped through the pages, realizing how deeply screwed they were. I think we should take some time to review this information before making any rash decisions. Richardson's expression didn't change. No. You're going to make a decision right now. Silence. The dean exhaled shakily, looking at Harrington. The professor, for the first time, looked truly afraid. Professor Harrington, the dean said, voice tight. Until further notice, you are relieved of your teaching duties pending a full review of your conduct. Harrington shot to his feet. You're suspending me? On what grounds? This is ridiculous. The governor stood as well, towering over him. You humiliated my son. You tried to sabotage his future. You thought he was powerless. But now you're going to learn what real consequences look like. Harrington's face burned red. He turned to the dean, desperate. You can't let him do this. The dean shook his head. I can't protect you from this, Douglas. Harrington looked like he wanted to scream, but he clenched his jaw, his fists shaking at his sides. He had spent years untouchable. One of the most powerful professors in the university. He had made and broken students' careers without a second thought. And now, with just a few words from Governor Richardson, his empire was crumbling. Richardson turned to the dean. And as for my son's academic record, I'll personally oversee a fair review of all his coursework, the dean said quickly. The governor gave a slow nod. Good. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The meeting was over. Meanwhile, Daniel had no idea what was happening inside the dean's office. He had spent the entire afternoon in his dorm room trying to prepare himself for the worst. He knew his father had power, but the system was strong. He had seen how these things usually went. Even when the truth was clear, people like Harrington always found a way to escape accountability. A knock at his door jolted him from his thoughts. Jake stood outside, grinning. You are not going to believe this. 30 minutes later, Daniel sat stunned as Jake pulled up the latest university announcement on his laptop. Breaking: Wellington University places Professor Douglas Harrington on leave amid investigation into student discrimination complaints. Daniel blinked. No way. Jake laughed. Dude, he's done. They're scrambling to save face right now. Daniel exhaled, his chest suddenly feeling lighter. For the first time in weeks, the weight of injustice wasn't crushing him. He had fought back. He had refused to be silenced. And he had won. News of Professor Harrington's suspension spread across Wellington University like wildfire. By the next morning, student forums were flooded with discussions. Some celebrated, others expressed shock, and a few, mostly his longtime supporters, claimed the professor was being unfairly targeted. But the facts were undeniable. Several other students, previous victims of Harrington's discrimination, had come forward after hearing the news. Their complaints, once ignored, were suddenly taken seriously. The university had no choice but to acknowledge that this wasn't just about one incident, it was a pattern of abuse. Daniel sat in the campus cafe, scrolling through the online discussions. Jake plopped down beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. Man, this is crazy, Jake said. Harrington's been untouchable for years. And now? The guy's practically a ghost. Daniel exhaled, still processing it all. I keep thinking, if my dad wasn't the governor, would this have happened? Jake shrugged. Maybe not. But so what? You didn't ask for special treatment, you just asked for fairness. Harrington dug his own grave. Daniel nodded slowly. That was true. His father's influence had forced the school to act, but Harrington had been guilty long before that. Across campus, Professor Harrington sat in his office, furious. His bookshelves, once a symbol of his prestige, felt meaningless now. He had spent years building his reputation, shaping the academic future of hundreds of students. And now? All it took was one mistake. One wrong target. If only he had known who Daniel was. But even as the thought crossed his mind, another realization hit him: it shouldn't have mattered. He had treated countless other black students the same way, assuming they had no power. He just never thought it would come back to haunt him. Now, the very institution he had served for decades had turned its back on him. The university wanted to protect its own reputation. They weren't going to save him. For the first time in his career, Harrington knew what it felt like to be powerless. As the days passed, Daniel noticed a shift on campus. Professors who once dismissed him with indifference were suddenly overly polite. Other students, some who had never even spoken to him before, now nodded in silent respect when they saw him. Even the dean had reached out personally, offering to ensure his academic standing remained intact. Justice had been served. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was only because of his last name. He had one. But what about all the others who didn't have a governor for a father? That thought stayed with him. Because this fight wasn't just about him. And it wasn't over yet. A week after Harrington's suspension, Wellington University announced a formal investigation into racial discrimination within its faculty. The news made headlines, drawing attention from students, alumni, and activists. Daniel watched as the school scrambled to control the narrative, not out of morality, but out of fear. They knew that if they didn't act, their reputation and funding would take a hit. Still, Daniel couldn't ignore the reality. If he weren't the governor's son, this never would have happened. One afternoon, as he walked through campus, a black freshman approached him hesitantly. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks. A lot of us noticed what happened and well, it meant something." Daniel smiled. "It wasn't just me." People finally spoke up. The student nodded. "Yeah, but you started it." As the student walked away, Daniel exhaled. He hadn't set out to be an activist. He had only wanted fairness. But now he realized he had a platform. And maybe, just maybe, he could use it to make sure that the next black student who faced injustice wouldn't need a powerful last name to be heard. This was just the beginning. The investigation into racial discrimination at Wellington continued for months, resulting in several faculty members being placed on leave and new policies being implemented. For Daniel, it was a bittersweet victory. He had won his personal battle, but the larger fight was far from over. His father's influence had made it possible, but Daniel knew that real change wouldn't come from the top down. It would come from people like him, those who refused to stay silent. As he walked across campus, Daniel felt a quiet sense of purpose. The fight for equality had just begun.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like.